Good evening, everyone. Hi, my name is McKenna Jordan, and I am the owner of Murder by the Book bookstore in Houston, Texas. We are one of the world's largest crime fiction specialty stores, and if you haven't heard of us, I would encourage you to go to our website, www.murderbooks.com, to check out some of the things we do, our recommendations, some of our upcoming events. We have 33 authors joining us virtually in February, so we do these virtual events quite a bit. Tonight, we are very excited to be joined by Beth Bechky and her guest interviewer, Melissa Mazmanian. But before I get to that, I'd like to talk about a couple highlights, things that we have going on. So we have our YouTube channel, Murder by the Book, which has all of our archived virtual events since March of 2020. I think there's over 100 events on there, so if you're interested, head over there. All of those recordings are free to watch. There's some big names on there and some fun things. Also, we just started a subscription box, Murder by the Box, which can be found at murderbythebox.com. There are 3 subscription plans. It's a monthly shipment, and we're really excited. We just launched this January. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, murderbythebox.com. If you have any questions this evening for Beth or for Melissa, you can put those in the comments on Facebook or in the live chat on YouTube. So right now, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. I'm going to add Beth back here. Hi, Beth.
Hi, McKenna.
All right, so Beth Bechky is the Seymour Milstein Professor of Ethics and Corporate Governance and Strategy at the Stern School of Business and a Professor of Sociology at New York University. She's here with us today to talk about her recent book, Blood, Powder, and Residue, How Crime Labs Translate Evidence into Proof, which is published by Princeton University Press. In it, she shows how the work of forensic scientists is fraught with the tensions of serving justice, constantly having to anticipate the expectations of the world of law and the assumptions of the public, while also staying true to their scientific ideals. Beth, I'm so happy to have you joining us tonight. How are you?
I'm great. It's so great to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, I'm very excited to have a nonfiction event. Both of my parents were in the police world, and my dad was a crime scene investigator, so I heard all about crime labs and things growing up. So I am ready to hear this discussion. We're also fortunate to have Melissa Mazmanian joining us as a guest interviewer, which I am always appreciative of a guest interviewer. Melissa is an associate professor of informatics at the Donald Bren School of Information and Computer Sciences and associate professor of organization and management at the Paul Marriage School of Management at the University of California, Irvine. Melissa's recent book with colleague Christine Beckman, titled Dreams of the Overworked, Living, Working, and Parenting in the Digital Age, explores how busy professionals and their families use communication technologies to enact myths of the ideal worker, perfect parent, and cultivated body, and the structures of scaffolding they rely on to do it all. Melissa, thank you so much. How are you?
I'm great. I'm so happy to be here to talk about Beth's book tonight.
Yes, it's so exciting. Okay, so what's going to happen right now is I'm going to go away. There it is. Yay, beautiful. I'm going to go away and I'm going to leave you two to talk. As I said before, please, if you're watching and you have any questions, there's no such thing as a dumb question. You can pop those in the comments or the live chat and we will get to them in a little bit. Everyone have fun, enjoy the discussion, and I'm going away.
Thanks, McKenna. Well, hello, everybody. As McKenna said, we're here to talk about Beth's new book. And I think it's a little bit of a different genre for the Murder by the Numbers bookstore. So I'm going to start by asking Beth a little bit about this book, how it came about, and kind of how did she get involved in Blood, Powder, and Residue. So Beth, can you tell us a little bit about how the book came about?
Sure. Basically, I'm a sociologist of work and organizations, and I study science and technical workers. And that's something that I've always been interested in. Although I'm a social scientist, I've always been interested in science. And the way I got interested in this project, basically, is I am an avid watcher of all sorts of crime shows, and And I'm also an avid reader of crime fiction, like probably a lot of people out here. And I was watching CSI and going, you know what? I bet it doesn't happen like that. I could study this. And that was what started the project. And it's kind of satisfied my need to learn more about science, while at the same time, my sort of social science interests.
Well, I'm definitely going to ask you about how it is different than what we see and hear on TV. But before we get there, given that you said that you're a sociologist of work, I think the audience might be a little bit interested in knowing, what does that actually mean? So can you tell us a little bit about kind of what do you do, and how did you kind of get the kind of information and data that you needed to write this book?
Yeah, sure. So I did what is known as an ethnography, which is essentially, think Margaret Mead, but in the workplace. So the idea here is you go into an organization, you sit around with everybody there, talk to them about their work and figure out what they're doing, and then think about it a lot and analyze what you think are the interesting dynamics there. I was in a crime lab basically for 18 months, and we always anonymize kind of our settings. So I call it the Metropolitan County Crime Laboratory. There are about 60 criminalists there. I spent 3 days a week there learning how to do forensic science. And then I left the organization and spent a lot of time reading my notes and thinking about it, and eventually writing the book.
Okay, so now I've got to know, when you say you actually were there for 18 months and that you actually learned to be a forensic scientist, I'm curious, what does that actually mean? It means going to lunch with someone, what does it mean to actually be there? Are you over someone's shoulder saying, what are you doing right now? Like, how does it actually come about?
Yeah, so it's going to lunch, but it's also sitting next to people while they do their work, asking them questions when they have time to talk. I like to actually try to do the work to get a sense of what it would be like to be a DNA analyst or a firearms examiner, for instance. In a crime lab, I couldn't try the actual work because, of course, I couldn't touch any of the evidence, right? I would sit there in my lab coat and take notes, but I also had a chance to try some things on my own evidence. So everybody was happy to let me kind of, okay, well, now you've seen us do a DNA analysis a bunch of times, because I was in the DNA area for months. You've watched us. You want to try to run your own DNA. And so like I swabbed the inside of my cheek, and one of the analysts kind of took me through. It takes like a week to do all the steps. You have to wait overnight. So I ran through all the different steps and eventually came out with my own DNA profile. And I was happy to discover that I'm an excellent pipetter, apparently.
Hidden skills that we didn't know you had. Well, and I guess I'm also kind of curious, given that you were there that long, like, how do people react to you? Do they think it's strange to be watched while they're doing their work?
I think at first everybody thinks it's strange, but I also think once you're sitting around a lot, I mean, you're in on the kind of conversations that people are having at work. I try to help people as much as possible. So you need somebody to run copies, I'm your gal, right? I think eventually people get used to having you there, and they ignore you a little bit. Usually people are also really excited to have somebody interested in their work. So if you ask somebody like, tell me, I missed that meeting yesterday, can you tell me about it? They will give you, a lot of information about what happened in that meeting. They're happy to share. And they're also happy to teach, this is how I do what I do. A lot of people are really happy to talk about what they do.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. We're at work a lot. Well, and you said that you first got interested in the crime lab by, like most of us, maybe sitting around watching CSI with the glossy sets and the beautiful people. And I'm curious, after this whole experience of being there for 18 months and writing this book, what are a few things that you think the average CSI watcher, like you or me, would be surprised to learn about the actual reality of doing this work?
Okay, so I think there are kind of two big things that I wasn't expecting. And I mean, you know that CSI isn't real. You're not going to go in there and see these hybrid super scientist investigator kind of people, right? I knew it was going to be bench science. That's not surprising. It is like complex bench science. You know, you have to have a science degree in order to do this job. You really have to know the science. On the other hand, I think what was most surprising was that most forensic scientists spend more time doing documentation than they do in the laboratory. So a lot of the work is really about how do we communicate what it is that we're doing in the lab to the people in the criminal justice community. So because that part of the job is has very high consequences, right? So the science in some ways is easy compared to figuring out how am I going to word this in my report to make sure that people understand the science. And so they spend a ton of time in conversations with one another, kind of talking about what's the best way for us to say this so people understand it.
Well, when you say where people understand it, it makes me wonder a little more like which people, because the science is going somewhere specific. It's going, as you said, into the criminal justice community, and you mentioned high stakes. So what exactly are they thinking about, and what are those wordings? What are they? You know, what's in their head when they're anticipating what might happen to the science?
Yeah, so I think there's basically two other main worlds that they're a part of, right? There's the criminal justice community, and those are people who don't know about science, but do know a lot about the legal system and justice. And then there's the public, who both read about it and see it on TV, but also they're the juries, right? So ultimately, the public is also a part of who their audience is going to be. And so but both sets of people, the community of criminal justice and the public, are both kind of scientific lay people. So they don't understand the science. People talk about how juries have an 8th grade education. Well, it's, you know, with that kind of person, they're not likely to understand what a DNA profile looks if you really dig down deep into the science. So that's a part of it. And then there's also, I think, the larger issue of translation for criminalists, for forensic scientists, is that the justice system is a very different culture than the science world, right? So they're very used to the world of science being the, you know, kind of, it's my job to find the natural truth about the world. And science is kind of impartial and kind of detached from what it is they're trying to figure out. So analysts will say things like, I don't know what, you know, I don't care what's going to come out in my findings. I don't have a horse in this race. It doesn't matter to me what the results are going to be. And then they go and interact with the criminal justice community. And especially in the legal system, it's very adversarial. So you have lawyers who are arguing over the truth with one another and advocating for either side. And that's a position that makes forensic scientists pretty uncomfortable.
Well, and I guess I'm thinking, like, pretend I'm a juror and I have the opportunity to sit in a trial that is using forensic science as some sort of material evidence. From your perspective now, what should I keep in mind?
It's very hard to have to spell deoxyribonucleic acid on the stand. No, so what you should keep in mind is that, okay, so the other thing that I didn't talk that much about that's also important to this is the kind of messiness of science. So I think what you need to keep in mind as a juror is that the lawyers are arguing, the scientists are trying to get their point across. And that point is not ever really. Science is not 100%. It's kind of messy. It's really subject to interpretation. And so knowing that a scientist is saying, you know, something like, you know, with this margin of error, I found something, is important to you to understand that all science has a margin of error, right? All of it has to do with interpretation. Nobody is going to come in and say, it's his DNA if they are a forensic scientist. They would never say that.
So the very fact that they're a good scientist means they're never going to give you the answer in that way.
Right, right.
So that actually shows their competency. Well, and that makes me wonder, so your book is titled Blood, Powder, and Residue. And it makes me wonder that these are 3 different kinds of evidence, right? And so I guess I'm curious about, can you tell us a little bit about the science of these different kinds of evidence, as well as the scientists themselves? So like what kinds of expertise they have to have in the different nature of these jobs.
Yeah, sure. So I think, first things first is the forensic scientists that we see on TV, and less in books, but I think on TV, tend to be kind of generalist super science types, right? That you watch them, they put, Abby from NCIS, she puts something on an instrument and it tells her 20 million different things about what she found, right? But in reality, the science of forensic science is very specialized, and it's different across different forms of analysis. Mm-hmm. So in the book, I kind of go to great lengths to kind of describe what are the different units of a crime lab, what are they doing in there, right? Mm-hmm. I think the one that we know, the one that's most recent, kind of the newest technology is DNA profiling. Mm-hmm. And in the lab that I studied, they called that unit the DNA princesses, because in DNA, they get a lot of funding from the government. There's a lot of support. There are a lot of analysts, and the technology and the instrumentation is super expensive. And it requires a lot of funding. Mm-hmm. It's the most recently validated in terms of courtroom procedures. There's a ton of instrumentation. But it's also very interpretive. If you see an the instrument that they use puts out these things called electropherograms, and you have to look at that and sort of be able to call the alleles in the DNA. Mm-hmm. So they spend a lot of time interpreting, but at the same time, there are these population statistics that they use to be able to argue this person, it's not a random person that we are talking about here who matches at these 16 places. It's this person, and only 1 in 350 million people have this particular profile in our local population. So they do a lot of Excel spreadsheets of statistics.
Sounds very sexy.
Nobody likes that part.
Right.
And that's a pretty different kind of science than, say, firearms examination. In firearms examination, what they're doing is using, most of the time, the examination is the function of the firearm. Does it fire, right? So they check that. But then it's the cartridges, or the cartridge cases, or the bullets that we find at a crime scene. Do they match the gun that we recovered, say? So they do a comparison under a microscope of those 2 bullets, one that they fire from the gun and one that they find that's found at the scene. The knowledge that firearms examiners have is deeply historical and kind of mechanical, right? So they spend 2 years of training, like visiting firearms manufacturers and figuring out how do different guns make particular marks on the bullet. And then they spend a lot of time at this microscope comparing lots and lots and lots and lots of bullets and cartridge cases from lots of different guns to be able to distinguish the different classes and the different characteristics of what is the mark on the firing pin that's made by the Smith & Wesson, and then, and so they would argue it's a much more subjective and holistic examination than some of the other types of science in the lab. Mm-hmm. You want me to keep going?
Well, I have more questions. I would like to know about fingerprints now that we've done 2.
Okay. Fingerprints. So I actually can't talk that much about fingerprints. There's not much in the book about fingerprints. Fingerprint examination is done by a lot of different people. And in the lab I studied, the comparative analysts did they created the prints, right? So they did the actual processing of the evidence, but fingerprint analysis is often done in police departments. So there are police officers who do the comparisons. The analysts that I knew in MCCL, in the lab that I studied, did the processing, and some of them had done analysis at other labs, but in the lab I studied, I didn't learn very much about that. I did learn a lot about narcotics, if you want me to talk about that.
Let's go to narcotics, and then I'll ask you some more questions about the differences.
Okay. Narcotics feels really like a craft. Narcotics is chemistry, basically. It's like figuring out, is this thing that the police brought in a plastic bag, is it a controlled substance, and how much does it weigh? Because most of the job of our narcotics analyst is to take the drug and say, oh, you picked this up, now we have to figure out what it actually is. And then, because sentencing depends on weight, we think the person was selling or not, they also have to figure out how much they have. And what I think is, I mean, I like science, so I was really excited about narcotics because it's like, it feels sort of Harry Potterish, but it's got like, we're going to do color tests, and we're going to put a tiny bit of the drug into each of these different kinds of solutions, and they're going to turn colors depending on, is it an opioid? Is it, is it methamphetamine? Is it marijuana? Right? And then that's just a kind of a clue to what it might be. And then they do what's called microcrystallography. So they're also looking through a microscope. They prepare a slide with a particular substrate on it, and then they drop a little bit in there, put the slide under the microscope, and it develops crystals. And those crystals have a characteristic shape that will tell them, like, what is this particular drug. So, and they have names for all the shapes, which is kind of interesting. So it's like 3D jacks and rabbit ears and, crosses. There's just all sorts of different labels. So then they do 2 different tests for each of the samples, so that they have 2 different chemical makeups that have 2, and then to double check. But it's very tactile, and you're like looking at it, you're smelling it, you're kind of seeing the color.
So, you found a few interesting words when describing all these, so on the one hand, you say that, that there's a craft element of the narcotics, and you talked about the firearms is a little bit of a holistic and subjective. It takes all these years of training of just really seeing all these different kinds of bullets and guns. Whereas the DNA testing is, this high statistical analysis. And so I guess what that makes me wonder is a little bit on the inside, do these groups work together? Are they very separate? Are there kind of power dynamics between them, right? Because they seem in some ways like very different kinds of jobs, but they're all in service of evidence.
Yeah, so actually, they don't really work together at all. And I think that was also a bit of a surprise to me. I was expecting that, as you know, but the audience doesn't, I study lots of coordination issues in organizations, and I was expecting that they would have to coordinate about the different evidence in the case. And it turns out they totally don't have to do that. They each are in a separate lab. Sometimes there are issues around, we have a piece of evidence and we have to decide how to analyze it, because if you analyze something for fingerprints, that totally adds chemicals that will screw up a DNA profile. If you scrape something or rub it, so you have a knife and it has a print on it and you want to print it, the powder to do the fingerprinting is going to make it hard to do a DNA profile. But then if you want to swab it, you're going to swab right through that fingerprint, and then you can't do a fingerprint analysis. So and that happened pretty rarely in the lab that I studied, but it does happen. And at that point, actually, the deputy director of the lab would come and say, can we figure out a way that you can both get evidence from this piece of evidence, right? And then they just would take it and go back to, or they would do a sequential processing of a piece of evidence. And so it really, they didn't spend very much time together at all, actually. I mean, they all had lunch together.
Well, but that's interesting because I also like that you said that they called the DNA princesses, and I can't help but wonder if that means that there was some power dynamics over, who are the prince and princesses of the lab, and how does that shake out in terms of which evidence is valued and in what ways?
Right. So I think the reason about the princesses, in addition to the fact that in general DNA gets a lot more funding and attention, is that more biologists are women. So in general, we have lots of like science. If you think about who does what in terms of science, biology is actually a lot more women than some of the other sciences. And so because DNA profiling is a biologically based kind of form of analysis, there tend to be more women in the DNA unit than in some of the other units.
Well, okay, so now I'm double fascinated because I don't know how much our audience has studied gender in the workplace, but it's definitely something I've studied. And it tends to be that when an occupation has more women than men, that occupation is seen as less than. It's valued less, the people are paid less, they probably have less value and prestige in the organization. But the DNA seems to be kind of a slightly different dynamic. So can you tell us a little bit more about gender?
I don't know that I have all that much to say, but so I would say that unlike I think some other science occupations, that in the DNA analysts are considered, they have higher status. It's partially related to the technical kinds of aspects, right? So it's a high instrumented, like high technique kind of area. In most of the other units in the lab that I studied, it's about half and half women and half men. So I didn't see a lot of, gender dynamics that I could really draw out here. But the DNA princesses is very evocative.
Right. And do they call themselves that? Or are they just
the day that I got introduced to the DNA supervisors, she said, "You'll probably hear this. They call us the DNA princesses."
Was she embarrassed, or was she like, how?
I think they thought it was funny.
Yeah. Well, you brought up the kind of technical aspects of DNA, and we're in a world, as everybody knows, where technology is changing all the time, especially in the workplace. And so I guess it makes me wonder, is the kind of the technologically rich aspects of doing DNA testing, is that affecting the other kinds of expertise, about like, I have to just know all the guns and have been around guns for years and years, how does technology affect how we see these different forms of expertise?
Yeah, so that's another, topic of the book. I spend a chapter or two talking about this, mostly because in the last decade or so, there has been this big push to make forensic science more like DNA, more science-y, kind of this idea that because DNA went through, since OJ, basically, DNA profiling has become like a very standardized and highly objective looking forensic science. And it comes from the outside of the criminal justice world, whereas some of the other disciplines have grown up within criminal justice, and they don't have the same roots in biology, say, as DNA does. And so in the last 10 years, there's been this push. There was a report that came out in 2009 from the National Academies of Science that basically said, some of forensic science doesn't have the scientific backing that DNA has, and we want you all to be more like DNA. And it's an interesting kind of story because, like we were just talking about, some of the disciplines that are involved in forensic science don't have the same science as DNA. So it's pretty difficult for them to look in any way like DNA. And that's particularly true of the comparative disciplines. So something like fingerprints or firearms. They don't have the kinds of population statistics that you can have in DNA analysis. And so they don't necessarily see how they can be more like DNA because the underlying science is different.
Mm-hmm. Well, then there's two implications of that I want to push on. One is like, how does that shake out in the labs themselves? So given those outside pressures, how do you see people responding to them? And I'm going to ask the second question because you might want to put them together, which is, as someone who has watched this, who's a little bit of an outside observer yourself, what do you make of this push to make DNA, to make all forensic science be more sciencey in that very specific DNA type way?
Yeah, so I think in some ways it's been really good for forensic science, right? So it's always good to push the science to make sure that it's valid. We don't want people producing science that isn't. On the other hand, it puts a lot of pressure on folks to make things look more like DNA when they don't really have too much of a basis to do so. And then the other thing I found that was really interesting is that we talked about this a little bit earlier, and we said, okay, well, there's the public and they have a certain kind of view on science, and then there's the legal system and they have a kind of view on science. In the public sphere, you see, for years I've been collecting articles about, is forensic science junk science? And there's a lot of kind of criticism of, say, firearms or other pattern matching disciplines. However, in the courts and in the lab, where the push for change is coming from is actually like, there's a lot of defense attorneys who are pushing DUI cases. And so toxicology is actually the part of forensic science that's changed the most in response to this push to be more like DNA. Also, they were it's a very instrumented field as well. It's like you put stuff on an instrument and it tells you, is there alcohol above a certain level in your sample? So it wasn't that difficult for them, but they've changed the way they testified to show error rates, for instance, which they didn't always do in the past, because that's typical in a DNA analysis, and that's something that's easy for them to do. So they've actually changed a bit more the way they write their reports and testify than, say, the firearms examiners, who really don't have much room for that kind of change.
Right. Well, and this goes right back to that idea that they're going to be using this science in the courtroom. And I'm assuming they don't do that all the time, but that's always the end goal of doing this kind of science. So it takes me back a second to be asking, after both being in the lab for this long, thinking about it, writing this book, and I'm going to ask you some questions about how you actually wrote the book. But before that, at this stage, what do you think? What is your take on the role of forensic science in our criminal justice system? I mean, there is a whole system here that is about attempting to, execute justice. And so what's your sense at this point, as someone who's really thought about this deeply?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think part of the question, and this came out also in the National Academies of Science report, is how close is a forensic lab to the legal system, right? So many labs are under the purview of either a police department, a sheriff's department, Department of Justice, FBI. It's under an agency of criminal justice, and their budgets are beholden to whoever runs that agency. So that's one issue I think that came out with this that's important to think about. So when I talk to lab directors, they would tell me, oh, you studied a district attorney lab. That's great, because I'm in a police lab. And, for me, it's really hard to justify my budget, because my boss basically has to decide, am I going to use this money to put 2 officers on the street or 4 officers on the street, or am I going to use it to buy another instrument for the DNA, unit? So there's that tension. I think the tension for a forensic scientist is more around, how do I, make my case in a way that I am both intelligible, so people understand what I'm saying, but I'm also legitimate, right? So I can say, like, here is, what I found. And where they see the tension is kind of in the lack of control over what they can say in court.
To say more.
Yeah, so I'll tell you the story about somebody who told me about a case that he was involved in. I'm going to call him Tim. That's not his real name, but he did a comparative analysis of some evidence, and the evidence, he did shoe print analysis. And so basically what happened, there was a crime scene where somebody had kicked in a door, and so there's a footprint on the door. Mm-hmm. And his job was to figure out the size of that footprint from a photograph, because the door was broken. So he has photographs of the door, the shoe print, and what he did his analysis, and he found that the shoe was a size 10.5 to maybe an 11.5. So of course there's going to be a range and some margin for error. And what he told me about this case was basically, well, I gave that evidence to the prosecutor, but the prosecutor didn't like it very much, and asked for a second opinion. So then Tim said, okay, I'll send the evidence out to this other guy, Joe, let's call him, who was his former teacher. So he learned how to do shoe print analysis from Joe. And Joe did his analysis, and he said, I think the shoe is between a size 11 and 12. Okay, so they were both very satisfied with this, because from his perspective, scientific perspective, like, there's an overlap here, so we're in the same place, and yeah, there's going to be a difference because we're giving a range, but our ranges overlap. And then, so what ends up happening is the prosecutor calls Joe to the stand because he gave the answer that fit with the suspect. And again, we're talking about this adversarial thing. The defense attorney calls Tim. The two of them go to court, and on the stand, Tim is testifying for the defense. And the prosecutor, and he works in this prosecutor's, office, basically, totally grilled him. And he said to me, he impugned my integrity. He put me up there as incompetent. And then afterwards, he said, the prosecutor was totally fine. He was like, oh, let's go grab a cup of coffee. And he said, I was going down my entire list of sailor words, and I couldn't find anything sufficient to say to him. Because you can see like the difference here, right? For the forensic scientist, the truth is the truth. And we're going in, we have truths, they overlap. We're good with that. We're not good with you saying that I'm incompetent because I didn't find the same truth as this other person. And that has implications not just for Tim, who's later on, all of this testimony is discoverable. And so somebody then in another courtroom can say, your prosecutor, you're calling this guy 2 years ago, you said he was incompetent on the stand. But also for the laboratory, because he basically put up somebody from his own laboratory and said, you're not good enough. And so this was a big issue for the forensic scientists. And this is kind of the tension that you see between, they're sort of outsiders to the criminal justice community, despite the fact that they work within it.
Well, and in some level, they necessarily need to be outsiders to have that impartial. I mean, if they weren't outsiders, that would make me even more concerned about the justice.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. And they need to have the connection, right? Because they can't really analyze the evidence without knowing, where did you find this? Where did you pick it up, right? They spend a lot of time thinking about who touched this? We need to know where was this located? Or I see blood in 5 places. Are we sure it's all from the same person? Or, exactly what happens. So they need some connection, but they don't, so those are kind of the issues surrounding it.
Well, and I'm thinking as a culture, as like an occupational culture within the lab, how do they maintain that part of, but different, sense of self? Because what that story you just told was so arresting, that this person felt like their entire, integrity was being challenged, where I'm assuming the lawyer was just trying to win the case. Right. Didn't really care about what that meant for this person's integrity as a scientist. So how do they maintain that insider outsider, both emotionally and culturally? How do they do that?
Well, I think it is somewhat emotionally hard. This job is emotionally hard, right? Because there's also the incredible responsibility of feeling like you're producing a finding that's going to change people's lives, right? Every time. Right? So like there's that responsibility. I think that one of the things I thought was super interesting about forensic scientists is that you immediately, hear the science and sort of the scientific ethos in the way they talk about things. So, earlier when I said they might say something like, I don't have a horse in this race, like they really truly believe in sort of the scientific method. Here's what I'm doing here. I need to make this as clean as possible. It might come in messy, but I'm going to clean it up and make sure that the science is as good as I can get it. And then they also have a super strong scientific community, right? So the way they do the science in the lab is very communal. And so nobody's ever just doing an analysis and throwing it over the wall, right? So there's a review process where after one analyst looks at the evidence and makes a judgment, provides a finding, the whole entire report is then completely reviewed by somebody else in the area, who then asks a ton of questions about, are you sure this interpretation is correct? Can you do it again? Can you write it differently? So everybody is being technically reviewed, and they spend, like I said, a lot of time kind of discussing, do we think this is correct? How do we want to phrase this? We want to make sure that the lawyers get it right if it goes to court. We don't want them to misinterpret the science. And the science truly matters to them. And so I think that it's a pretty strong scientific culture. And I think that that's really what does it.
Well, that leads right to my last question about this, which was, for anybody who's listening, who's thinking, do I want to be a forensic scientist, in my next life or in my current life? Every job has its challenges, but hopefully there's also rewards. So I guess I'm curious, what are the rewards for these people and what do they love about their job?
Yeah, so I think, one of the things I did was I did a set of interviews with people where I talked to them about their career histories, and I asked them, like, why did you become a forensic scientist, right? And I think there's a couple of things. One is kind of people have a service orientation, right? Like they're saying, I want to help people. It really I want to make sure that this is done correctly. What I can do can help change people's lives, right? Then the other thing is that they also have like curiosity and a sense of mystery. So some people would tell me stories about how, when I was a kid, I got a fingerprint kit and I dusted everything in my mother's kitchen. I wasn't sure, and this is what, she ended up doing with her career. So I think there is also this sense of the scientific curiosity is very strong. And I mean, you have to know the science, but then I think some folks who get into this don't realize how much of it's going to be this translation work. They don't realize I'm going to spend time in court. I'm going to, kind of have to tell people the science in a non-scientific way. I'm going to have to figure out, how can I describe DNA profiling? Oh, I'm going to make an analogy to Xerox copying. I'm going to have to be able to do that. I think they're not always prepared for that aspect of the job. So I would say if you're in high school and you're thinking about becoming a forensic scientist, know that you have to know your science cold, but that you are not going to be sitting at a bench. That in fact, your job is going to be about boundary spanning and communicating science to other people. And so you need to like that a bit, and you need to be good at it, right? Because that's kind of the trade-off there.
Well, that was one of the most interesting things I found about your book. And I'd like to ask a little bit about the process of writing this kind of book. But one of the themes that you really come up is the kind of, what does it mean to be someone whose job is to articulate? So this idea that there's a certain kind of work that's really different from science, but it's about translating and articulation. And that was a really powerful theme in the book for anybody who's thinking of getting it. It's a really, really interesting read. And so I guess I'm curious, can you tell us a little bit, you are not your typical, this is not a fiction crime book. You don't just sit there and make it up in your head. So can you tell us a little bit about the process of writing this kind of book, which is really based on real people and this very, very deep interaction with them?
Yeah, so I guess part of the challenge of doing a book like this is that I don't have, nothing bad happened when I was in the lab for 18 months. There was not any major drama. There are some, if I had been in Boston when there was the big scandal about the Annie Dukin and the whole narcotics, dry labbing where she wasn't doing any of the chemistry, I would have had a very compelling character story to tell about this.
Right? I interrupt you, Beth. So for those of you, no one knows this, but my husband is a criminal defense. He's a public defender. And there are literally 4 boxes in our garage. We live in California. We lived in California for over 10 years that he refuses to give away because they were all drug cases from Boston, because he used to be a public defender in Boston, that she may have touched. And he says, I can't give these away because at any point these could come up and be challenged because this person tampered with and didn't treat so much evidence. Yeah.
So yeah, she tampered. She didn't analyze it. She just kind of guessed what it was. She tampered with it. She took bits of cocaine and put it into other, but like, that is highly unusual, right? Like, that is somebody who's criminal, right? Like, that is not somebody who's taking their science seriously. And so I did not see things like that. I saw people behaving responsibly, and I saw, and I spent time with almost 60 people, right? Like, that's how big the laboratory was. So I don't have like a character that I can spin out through the course of the book. And instead, what I have are a lot of vignettes, a lot of stories that I'm linking together to write a larger story that gives you a picture of what a criminalist does every day, right? And so that means that what I spend time doing, like my analysis process, is to think about, well, what's important here? So for instance, the story I just told you about Tim's shoe print case, right, and going to court, one of the things that I discovered immediately, the first day I went to a crime lab, people were constantly talking in the halls to each other, to me, about going to court. And I thought, oh, I'm going to be going to court a lot. I better dress differently, like if I'm going to have to follow them to court. And then, like, over time, so I gave everybody my card, and I said, tell me when you're coming to court. I'll meet you, and I'll go to court with you. Because they were so concerned about going to court and worried. And they talked a lot about what happens in court and how you get treated when you go to court, and are you able to be, credible, and what's, how nervous they were, and how they got sweats and they threw up. I mean, everybody was constantly talking about this. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to be in court all the time. They almost never go to court. Criminalists never go to court. And Melissa, I'm sure you know about this, because so many cases plead out, so many cases get dropped. They're doing the analysis. The lawyers will stipulate. They will say, yes, we agree that this was, this person's DNA, or yes, we agree they were both there, or whatever the issue is. We agree that the analysis was fine. And so then they don't go in. So only in about 2% of the cases do criminalists go to court. And so then I started thinking, like, okay, this seems really weird. Why are they always talking about it? And so I really started to think, and the Tim story kind of gives you a sense for why they're always thinking about it. Because when they do go, it's a super big event. The responsibility is very heavy. It, weighs on them. And it is very different in culture from what they do in the lab. Instead of hanging out and asking, do you think this is right? Does this sound good to you? Is this, can you rerun this for me? Instead of doing that, they're on the stand. They're the person who signed off on that report. And 2 different people are asking them kind of uninformed questions about, how did you get to this point? And by the way, we think you're wrong. And so that story, that when I heard the shoe print story, I thought, well, this is the way I'm going to blow out this chapter. And I had really started to think about, like, the specter of testifying as being something that was super meaningful to lots of different criminalists. And many of them told me stories about their court experiences. And so back to the question about the writing, right? What I did was basically I usually do this when I write, is I start from the stories that are most interesting to me, and I kind of pick them apart, right? And I say, why do I think this is happening? What's interesting about it? What are the other people that I've talked to that have related stories? And then I weave those stories together So like the chapter in my book, I think it's chapter 5, that's about testimony, has Tim's story in it, right? But it also has stories of DNA analysts and toxicologists and, lots of different forensic scientists who have experiences going to court, and how that experience kind of shapes what I call the culture of anticipation in the lab, how they spend a lot of time when they're outside of court preparing to go to court, or preparing their report to be read by somebody who's in court, right? So that the way they link to the system is through kind of this testimony experience.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. You never actually go to court unless the evidence were integral to the case, like contested. So if the attorneys were making the case based on some question about the evidence, otherwise they would never need them. So it's only when it's contested would show up. That's really interesting. But that makes me wonder too, your book does more than just tell stories, though it does do an excellent job of telling stories and really getting the kind of nitty gritty of these people's lives. You have some bigger points about what does it mean to be an expert in today's world. And I guess from a writing perspective, I'm curious both, where does that story come from? And could you end by telling the audience a little bit about your opinions about what it means to be an expert in today's world?
Yeah, great. I can do that. So I think all technicians, not just forensic scientists, are expert workers, right? What they do takes training, a lot of both, education, but also on the job, like kind of learning, getting tacit knowledge, figuring out how to do something like this. And so they have expertise. And I think more and more experts are being put in positions where they have to translate their expertise to other worlds, to other sets of people. They work in situations where that's a requirement for their job. So if you think about, teachers is the most obvious one, but doctors, scientists and technicians of all forms. I was telling somebody about the book, and he used to work as somebody who does movie ratings in Hollywood. Like his job was basically to convince the ratings agencies that the movies that they were producing in the studio he worked with should have an R or PG rating. And he's like, what you're telling me about the culture of anticipation, that was my job. I spent all this time thinking about how am I going to translate this to this other audience. I think that what I saw going on here in the crime lab was this kind of culture of anticipation, and what they were doing was both this kind of translation, and thinking about the language, the tools. Oh, I'm going to bring a big digital image of the cartridge cases into court. The ways that they can convince the jury and the attorneys that they have a compelling, finding. At the same time, they want to maintain the, kind of their allegiance to the truth of the science, right? So protecting the science and also, kind of translating it for others. And that kind of balancing act that they're doing is true for a lot of different kinds of experts. In addition, we didn't talk about this very much, but the other piece of it is this education piece. So they're constantly talking about how we're going to educate the criminal justice community. So they're going to educate the attorneys by offering training, and they're constantly kind of negotiating with the legal community. No, telling a prosecutor, no, I can't analyze these 100 beer bottles to get DNA profiles because it's not going to be probative, this is why gunshot residue that's found on the hand of a suspect doesn't necessarily mean that person fired a gun, right? So they're taking the time to kind of educate this other part of the community as to the science. So they're doing both things. And I think this kind of balancing act where is a big job of experts. And you can see it. You can see it in, if you've ever gone to the doctor and they're giving you a diagnosis, you can see how they're trying to get their knowledge to you in a way that you'll take your medicine. Right? So there's an element of convincing and an element. So again, back to the sort of notion of got to be intelligible to these people, but it also needs to be legitimate, right? And that's sort of a balance. Currently, we've seen it for the past 9 months with the pandemic, right? To really see the early public statements from the CDC and kind of, should you be wearing a mask? Well, what can we say to convince people to wear a mask without having a run on masks, right? The position of experts in these larger systems means that they have to do a lot of translation. And with science especially, they're doing it in their own world, which is very interpretive, which has margins for error, and which is constantly changing. So that's why, like, when you think about the pandemic, what we know now about what masks protect us from is different than what we knew in March. But the scientists still had to get out there and make statements regardless of how certain they were about their knowledge, right? And that causes, that's sort of a tension that a lot of expert work faces.
Well, and also the idea of the pandemic makes me think that, as well as the idea about the court and the shoe prints, that it's in certain people's interest to attack the expertise. And we have to think about whose interest is it to attack the expertise and why. And that's something that's maybe a bigger point as well. But welcome back, McKenna.
Hi, I've just been sitting here delighted by the conversation. It's been fascinating. We do have a couple quick questions before we wrap up for the evening. I'm going to pop these up here on the screen. So the first is from Connie. Are there standards or regulations to standardize procedures from lab to lab? And how can we have confidence in lab outputs?
Okay, Connie, that's a great question. And I was surprised to find that, in fact, there are no laws about this. Many labs voluntarily accredit themselves. So there's an organization that does accreditation of the labs, and it's super detailed. It's every few years. They send a team of experts from other labs around the country to come in. They do like a several-day process of auditing of the lab to make sure you're following good procedures. So many labs go through accreditation, and that gives them and us, I think, more confidence that they're following correct procedure, but it is not required in the United States.
Wow, that's fascinating. All right, so our last question for the night is from Jonathan. It says, one of the greatest pleasures of the job, knowing that you can prevent follow-up crimes by assisting the prosecution of criminals or murderers the first time around.
So that's an interesting question. So you don't see a lot of criminalists talking about that. And I will tell you, they feel like, so again, this goes back to what Melissa and I were talking about in terms of their allegiance to the science. I think they feel good that the truth comes out, and the truth may help put somebody, behind bars who might commit other crimes. And by the way, they are always like, when it's a case that involves something like murder, right? Like that's the top of the priority list in a lab, right? We're analyzing everything possible related to that crime because we feel a great responsibility to that. On the other hand, I had a firearms examiner who told me a whole story about how this woman had shot her husband. And they did it. He was asking all these questions about, well, yeah, her gun worked, and he was doing the analysis. And then he was looking at this piece of evidence, which was, he asked them, like, was there a hole in the jacket? Like, he had figured out that the husband had been reaching for his gun when the woman fired hers. And, he was like, I was really grateful that I could help her. Right, that we could put together a theory of what happened that supported, what she was saying. So I think that happens, but it happens less often than you think because of this separation that Melissa and I were talking about between the criminal justice community and the lab. So you send your findings. If the lawyers both agree that we're going to stipulate, we're going to use them, you never hear another word about your case. And you go to testify, and it is rare that the attorneys have time to follow up and tell you what happened as a criminalist. So sometimes they don't even know.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess their job is just to provide the data, the facts, and then that's reward enough in and of itself. All right. Well, I think we have reached the point of the evening where we're going to wrap up. I have absolutely enjoyed this discussion. Beth, Melissa, thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and close out this by saying, If you are interested in ordering a copy of Beth's new book, thank you, Melissa. We have them available at Murder by the Book in Houston. We ship all over the world, and our website is www.murderbooks.com. If you missed the beginning of this and you want to see it from the beginning or check out some of our other virtual events, just visit our YouTube channel, which is Murder by the Book. Thank you both again. Thank you all for watching, and everyone have a wonderful evening.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's been a pleasure. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.